On a cold morning in San Francisco, federal agents walked into a crowded public library with a quiet purpose. Moments later, they placed handcuffs on a 29-year-old man named Ross Ulbricht. To most people around him that day, he looked ordinary, calm, unremarkable, almost forgettable. But behind his laptop screen, Ulbricht had been running one of the most notorious underground marketplaces the internet had ever seen. He called it the Silk Road, inspired by the legendary trade routes that once linked distant civilizations. His version, however, operated far from ancient caravans. It lived in the hidden corners of the dark web, where anonymity reigned and illegal drugs moved like digital currency. Over nearly 3 years, the platform grew into a sprawling empire, handling hundreds of millions of dollars in transactions through Bitcoin. Ulbricht believed he had crafted a perfect system, one without faces, footprints, or consequences. But in the end, it was his own trail of small, invisible mistakes that set the stage for his downfall. Ross Ulbricht's story didn't begin in the shadows of the dark web, nor did it start with criminal intent or an obsession with illicit trade. His origins were surprisingly ordinary. Born in Austin, Texas, he grew up in a loving, middle-class household with parents who encouraged curiosity, learning, and self-improvement. Friends described him as bright, thoughtful, and unusually idealistic for someone his age. He excelled academically, gravitating toward science and engineering with a passion that seemed almost preordained. Ross wasn't the type of person anyone expected to become the architect of an online drug empire. But in hindsight, the seeds of his future were already sprouting long before he typed a single line of code for Silk Road. After high school, Ross enrolled at the University of Texas at Dallas, where he pursued a degree in physics. He was driven not only by intellectual curiosity, but by a deeper, almost philosophical desire to understand how the world worked at its most fundamental level. Physics appealed to him because it offered structure, logic, and certainty qualities he found grounding. Yet, beneath that structured exterior lurked a restless imagination. Ross was drawn to ideas that challenged traditional systems, especially those involving freedom, decentralization, and economic autonomy. He believed deeply in personal liberty and the right for individuals to make choices without government oversight, even if those choices were controversial. After graduating, Ross continued his academic path by attending Penn State University, where he attempted to earn a master's degree in materials science and engineering. But something changed during these years. He became increasingly disillusioned with the rigid structure of academia and the narrow career paths that seemed inevitable for someone with his background. He didn't want to spend his life in a laboratory or stuck in the hierarchy of a corporate job. Ross wanted freedom, creative, financial, and philosophical. And that craving for freedom gradually morphed into something more, a desire to create a system that embodied his beliefs about autonomy. It was around this time that Ross discovered libertarian philosophy. He immersed himself in the writings of Ludwig von Mises, Murray Rothbard, and other thinkers who championed free markets and minimal government intervention. These ideas resonated deeply with him. He believed that individuals should be free to transact without interference, and he saw government control as a barrier to genuine economic freedom. These beliefs didn't make him dangerous or radical on their own, but they planted the ideological foundation that would one day support Silk Road. After dropping out of graduate school, Ross bounced between business ideas. He attempted to start a video game company, developed a solar panel business with a friend, and even tried stock trading for a while. Nothing stuck. Each failure chipped away at his confidence, but also pushed him further toward more unconventional dreams. He wanted not just to create a business, but to create something meaningful, something big. Then came the idea that changed everything. Bitcoin had just begun emerging in obscure tech communities. It wasn't widely understood, but to Ross, it represented exactly what he had been searching for: a decentralized currency with no control from banks or governments. It was freedom, digitized. And paired with Tor, a network that allowed anonymous browsing, the pieces for a new kind of marketplace began to fall into place in his mind. A marketplace that embodied absolute autonomy. A marketplace where individuals could buy or sell anything without government interference. A marketplace defined by ideology as much as utility. Ross began writing code for what he initially called underground brokers. It was rough, buggy, and incomplete. But the concept was clear: an anonymous online market powered by Bitcoin and hidden on Tor. Over time, the project evolved. He changed the name to something more poetic, Silk Road, invoking the legendary trade networks that once connected ancient civilizations. To Ross, it felt symbolic. Just as the old Silk Road bypassed borders and facilitated the free movement of goods, his Silk Road would bypass digital borders and facilitate unregulated commerce. In his mind, he wasn't building a criminal empire. He was building a libertarian experiment. But intention didn't matter. What mattered was how people used it. The moment he launched Silk Road in early 2011, word spread quickly across online forums. People were shocked. A hidden marketplace where users could anonymously buy drugs with Bitcoin? It sounded impossible, but it worked. And once the first successful transactions were completed, the floodgates opened. Sellers flocked to the platform, listing everything from marijuana and LSD to heroin and cocaine. Buyers praised the anonymity. Reviews shaped vendor reputations. And within months, Silk Road had become something Ross never fully anticipated: the largest, most sophisticated online drug market in the world. As Silk Road grew, so did Ross's role. Operating under the pseudonym Dread Pirate Roberts, he became the administrator, moderator, and visionary leader of the platform. He answered disputes, enforced rules, banned violent services, and maintained a kind of digital order. Yet with each passing month, the weight of what he had created pressed heavier on him. The stakes were rising. The FBI was beginning to notice. And Ross, despite being intelligent and cautious, made small mistakes that, like tiny cracks in a foundation, would eventually widen into the fault lines that led to his downfall. As Silk Road expanded beyond anything Ross Ulbricht initially imagined, the platform began to take on a life of its own. What started as a libertarian experiment quickly evolved into an ecosystem with its own culture, expectations, and hierarchy. Vendors built reputations like storefronts. Customers discussed product quality with the same seriousness as critics reviewing fine wines. And behind all of it, hidden deep inside the dark web, the dread pirate Ross quietly watched his creation transform into something both impressive and increasingly dangerous. From the outside, Silk Road appeared unbreakable. It was protected by Tor's layers of encryption, Bitcoin's anonymity, and a loyal user base. But inside, Ross knew the truth. It was a fragile machine held together by his sleepless nights, endless coding sessions, and constant paranoia. He spent hours each day patching vulnerabilities, answering messages, updating security systems, and moderating disputes that often felt more like digital standoffs. He had no employees at first, only himself, a laptop, and a belief that he could handle whatever came next. But the demand was overwhelming. As more users flooded the marketplace, Ross realized he could no longer run the entire operation alone. The moment he recruited moderators, developers, and trusted lieutenants, he took the first step into a world where trust became both essential and dangerous. These people knew too much. They had access to the inner workings of Silk Road, and some carried motives that went far beyond libertarian ideology. One of the most influential figures Ross encountered was a mysterious user known as Variety Jones. Intelligent, manipulative, and always one step ahead, Jones became both Ross's mentor and his greatest liability. He advised Ross on operational security, ethics of the marketplace, and even the idea of expanding Silk Road into a broader empire. He was the first to suggest Ross fully embrace the Dread Pirate Roberts persona, not just as an alias, but as a mythic figure capable of inspiring loyalty and fear. Ross took his advice. The persona became legendary. And slowly, Ross began to blur the line between who he was and who he pretended to be. As the platform grew, so did federal interest. The Drug Enforcement Administration, FBI, IRS, and Homeland Security all launched investigations, though most had no idea where to start. Silk Road was unlike anything they had seen. It was decentralized, anonymous, and invisible. Traditional investigative strategies were useless. Agents combed through online forums, tracked Bitcoin transactions, and attempted to infiltrate the site as vendors or buyers. But Silk Road's design made it difficult to penetrate. Even when investigators gained access, uncovering the identity of the Dread Pirate Roberts seemed impossible. What Ross didn't know was that the federal investigation was already making small breakthroughs that stem not from sophisticated cyber forensics, but from human error. One FBI analyst came across a 2011 forum post promoting a new anonymized drug marketplace, The post used a specific username. That username had appeared years earlier, connected to Ross in an unrelated discussion. A single slip, a tiny connection. A seed the government quietly planted and nurtured. No one realized Ross had already left faint fingerprints scattered across the internet long before Silk Road reached its peak. Meanwhile, Silk Road itself was becoming increasingly chaotic. With more vendors came more disputes, scams, and threats. Some sellers offered services that violated Ross's personal moral code, such as weapons or violence for hire. He banned them repeatedly, insisting Silk Road should only allow victimless transactions. But in the dark web, boundaries blurred quickly. Ross found himself conflicted, advocating for freedom on one hand, yet acting as the authoritarian gatekeeper of his own digital world on the other. The stress consumed him. He moved frequently, never staying long enough to be noticed. He lived like a digital ghost, constantly monitoring his surroundings, always afraid someone was watching, but the work never stopped. Ross spent up to 16 hours a day behind his screen, managing disputes, approving listings, updating code, and responding to crises. Over time, Silk Road's success became a prison one he built but couldn't escape. The federal investigation deepened. Undercover agents infiltrated the platform, posing as drug dealers, money launderers, and even assassins. One undercover agent slowly gained Ross's trust, exchanging messages that would later become key pieces of evidence. Another agent, unbeknownst to his department, secretly stole Bitcoin from Silk Road and attempted to blackmail Ross into paying him off. Corruption was everywhere, on both sides of the law. Despite the storm forming around him, Ross continued expanding Silk Road. He implemented complex security protocols, encrypted communication systems, and escape plans. He even considered building a replacement site, Silk Road 2.0, designed to be even more anonymous and impenetrable. But no matter how sophisticated the technology became, the smallest human errors continued to chip away at the fortress he believed he had created. By 2013, Silk Road had processed hundreds of millions of dollars in transactions. The media began reporting on it. Politicians demanded investigations. Journalists started hunting for clues. And Ross found himself trapped between a digital ideology and the real-world consequences closing in on him. He wanted to shut everything down. But he couldn't. Too many people depended on Silk Road. Too many vendors had built their livelihoods on it. And Ross, despite his fear, couldn't walk away from the world he had created. The Dread Pirate Roberts' identity had become too powerful to abandon. It gave him purpose, control, and a sense of destiny, even as it pulled him deeper into danger. The federal agents chasing him weren't just trying to dismantle a marketplace, they were trying to unmask a myth. And as they closed the distance, Ross continued to believe he could outsmart them, unaware that several silent clues scattered across the internet were already pointing straight to him. By mid-2013, the hunt for the Dread Pirate Roberts had transformed from a scattered, uncertain investigation into a coordinated federal pursuit. Multiple agencies, each working their own angles, were getting closer. Even if Ross Ulbricht remained unaware of just how narrow his margin for error had become. Silk Road continued thriving, pulling in millions of dollars in monthly transactions, but with every success came a rising tidal wave of scrutiny. The platform had grown too large, too influential, and too visible. What had begun as a hidden libertarian experiment was now national news. For Ross, the walls were closing in from every direction. Still, Ross believed his digital fortress could withstand anything. He relied on Tor for anonymity, Bitcoin for financial opacity, and his own relentless discipline for operational security. He used encrypted messaging, routinely wiped devices, and avoided patterns in his daily life. But technology alone wasn't enough. The greatest threat to Silk Road and to Ross was never the code, it was people. People made mistakes. People left clues. And Ross, for all his intelligence and caution, was still human. One of the earliest cracks investigators exploited came from a simple oversight, an old forum post Ross had made years before. Long before Silk Road existed, he had asked a question about how to use Tor and anonymous servers. At the time, it seemed harmless. But the username he used appeared again in early discussions promoting Silk Road's launch. It wasn't definitive proof, but it was a thread investigators began pulling. And as they tugged, more threads emerged. Agents discovered Ross had once posted a job listing for a Bitcoin programmer using his real email. That same programmer later appeared inside Silk Road's development history. A subtle connection, but a connection nonetheless. Then there were the shipping records. While Ross lived a transient lifestyle, floating between apartments and shared housing, investigators traced a handful of packages to addresses linked to him. Some were innocuous deliveries, others contained equipment he used to run Silk Road servers. In isolation, each detail meant nothing. Together, they formed a faint outline one federal agents were slowly coloring in. Meanwhile, within Silk Road, Ross grappled with challenges of his own. As the site expanded, power struggles emerged. Moderators clashed. Vendors threatened each other. Opportunists tried to scam the marketplace. Ross felt enormous pressure to maintain order, pressure he handled with a strange mixture of idealism and ruthlessness. He banned sellers who violated rules, mediated disputes with surprising patience, and tried to maintain fairness. Yet, under the Dread Pirate Roberts persona, he also authorized actions that contradicted his earlier principles. When he believed certain individuals threatened Silk Road's stability or his own anonymity, Ross became willing to consider extreme measures. In conversations with undercover agents posing as hitmen, Ross discussed violent solutions. Whether he intended to follow through or was simply posturing remains debated, but the messages themselves were damning. They revealed a man who, backed into a corner, felt responsible for guarding an empire he never expected to rule. In his attempt to protect a marketplace built on the idea of freedom, Ross became entangled in the darkest decisions of his life. Behind the scenes, the investigation intensified. Carl Force, a DEA agent working undercover, made contact with Ross through Silk Road. Their conversations became a key piece of evidence. Unknown to his own superiors, Force began stealing Bitcoin and attempting to extort Ross. In one instance, he fabricated threats from another user and demanded payment for protection. Ross, overwhelmed and paranoid, complied. The corruption within law enforcement added layers of complexity to the case, creating chaos even among investigators. At the same time, FBI cyber specialists made what would become the breakthrough discovery. By analyzing how Silk Road's login pages responded when viewed through certain misconfigurations, they found a clue: a real IP address leaking from behind Tor's anonymity layers. That IP address belonged to a server in Iceland. Once agents gained access to the server, they found everything: the customer database, the vendor listings, transaction logs, private messages, and critical files tying Silk Road directly to the Dread Pirate Roberts. Suddenly, what had seemed like an unsolvable digital puzzle began snapping into place. They had the infrastructure. They had the messages. They had the ledger. Now they needed the man. Ross sensed the pressure but didn't understand the extent of the threat. He believed he was managing the site effectively, even preparing to expand it. He wrote in his journal about improvements he wanted to make, describing Silk Road as something akin to a digital uprising against government control. His writings were philosophical, confident, and deeply personal. Yet in the margins of those same entries, he revealed doubt. He questioned his future, his identity, and the possibility of freedom. The Dread Pirate Roberts persona empowered him, but it also consumed him. All the while, Ross tried to live quietly in San Francisco. He frequented coffee shops, worked from libraries, and avoided drawing attention to himself. He didn't live lavishly. He didn't flaunt his wealth. He preferred minimalism and solitude. To bystanders, he was just another young man on a laptop. But agents were closing in. They tracked his movements. They monitored his communications. They watched the pattern of logins between Silk Road servers and public Wi-Fi hotspots around the city. Each piece aligned more precisely than the last. Eventually, investigators narrowed his location down to a single public library. They planned an arrest that required flawless timing. Ross had to be caught with his laptop open, logged in as the Dread Pirate Roberts, before he could close the lid and encrypt everything. Agents staged a distraction. A man and woman pretended to argue behind Ross while undercover officers slipped in from both sides. In one swift motion, they grabbed his laptop before he could react. On his screen, Silk Road's administrative panel was open messages, commands, logs, everything. Ross Ulbricht, the Dread Pirate Roberts, was caught in the act. It was over. Years of pursuit, careful investigation, and small digital clues had led to one moment in a quiet library. The myth dissolved instantly. The empire collapsed. And Ross, calm but visibly stunned, realized the truth. A few small mistakes had undone everything he believed he had built. In the days following Ross Ulbricht's arrest, the reality of what had happened began to sink in, not only for him, but for the entire online world that had followed Silk Road's meteoric rise. News outlets exploded with headlines announcing the fall of the dark web's most infamous marketplace. Politicians praised law enforcement for dismantling what they called a criminal empire. Users who once trusted Silk Road's anonymity panicked, unsure whether their data had been exposed. And investigators, after years of chasing shadows, finally had the man they believed responsible for it all. Ross was taken into federal custody and held without bail. As the government built its case, the evidence against him seemed overwhelming. They had the server in Iceland, containing every order, every message, every transaction logged on Silk Road. They had Ross's own laptop, captured while still unlocked, revealing administrator dashboards, chat histories, journal entries, and files clearly connecting him to the dread pirate Robert's identity. They had Bitcoin wallets linked to Silk Road commissions. And they had messages showing Ross making decisions no administrator could easily defend in court. Yet despite the mountain of evidence, Ross insisted he wasn't the sole mastermind. His attorneys argued that the dread pirate Roberts persona could have been used by multiple people. They proposed that Ross had been involved early on but stepped away, leaving others to run the site under the same name. The defense portrayed him as idealistic, curious, and misguided, someone who believed in personal freedom but never intended to create a global drug market. They painted Ross as a scapegoat for a decentralized platform that had evolved far beyond his control. But the prosecution wasn't convinced. To them, Ross Ulbricht wasn't a visionary, he was a kingpin. And they planned to prove it. Throughout the trial, prosecutors presented Silk Road as a meticulously orchestrated criminal enterprise. They highlighted the scale of drug sales, from small-time marijuana vendors to sophisticated distributors selling heroin, cocaine, and fentanyl. They displayed charts showing hundreds of millions of dollars flowing through Bitcoin wallets connected to the site. They argued that Ross knowingly created a system that facilitated illegal commerce and profited from it through commissions. They emphasized the harm that came from the drugs sold, pointing to overdoses and real-world consequences. The most damaging evidence came from Ross's own digital trail. His journal entries revealed not just operational details, but philosophical reflections on the project. In one entry, he described his goal: to build a marketplace outside government control where individuals could transact freely. In another, he reflected on the enormity of what Silk Road had become, expressing both pride and fear. These writings made it difficult for the defense to argue he was a passive participant or an unwitting bystander. Messages between Ross and various Silk Road staff members further eroded the defense's narrative. They showed Ross making executive decisions, solving disputes, and coordinating site operations. They also contained discussions about violent threats and potential hits conversations. Prosecutors used to paint him as dangerous, even if the alleged violence never materialized. Ross's lawyers argued that these exchanges were exaggerated, hypothetical, or the result of manipulation by corrupt agents. But the words remained on screen, displayed for the jury to see. As the trial progressed, the courtroom became a battleground of conflicting ideologies. On one side, Ross's supporters saw him as a pioneer of digital freedom, punished for challenging powerful institutions. On the other, prosecutors framed him as a criminal mastermind whose platform enabled widespread harm. The truth, as always, was more complicated than either extreme. In February 2015, after weeks of testimony and evidence, the jury delivered their verdict: guilty on all 7 charges, including narcotics trafficking, money laundering, and hacking conspiracy. Ross stood motionless as the verdict was read. The weight of the moment, the years of work, the collapse of everything he built, it all settled silently around him. But the trial was only the beginning. The sentencing would determine whether Ross spent decades or the rest of his life in prison. During the sentencing hearing, Ross addressed the court. He spoke with emotion, acknowledging his involvement and expressing regret for the harm caused. He insisted he never wanted to hurt anyone and that he believed in the principles behind the platform, even if the outcome spiraled far beyond his intentions. He asked the judge for leniency, hoping for a chance at redemption. Victims' families also spoke, describing the devastating losses they attributed to drugs purchased on Silk Road. Their testimonies painted a stark contrast to Ross's idealism, grounding the case in the harsh reality of addiction and loss. When Judge Catherine Forrest delivered the sentence, the courtroom fell into a heavy silence. She condemned Silk Road as a thoroughly unprecedented criminal platform and argued that Ross needed to serve as an example. She sentenced him to 2 life terms plus 40 years, with no possibility of parole. It was one of the harshest sentences ever handed down in a case involving nonviolent offenses. In the aftermath, the reaction was divided. Some saw the sentence as justice and appropriate response to the scale of Silk Road's impact. Others saw it as excessive, a warning shot to deter future digital rebels. Supporters launched petitions calling for clemency, arguing that Ross's punishment was far more severe than those given to violent offenders. They emphasized the corruption among the agents involved in the investigation, pointing to the misconduct of Carl Force and others as proof that the case was tainted. Meanwhile, other key figures in Silk Road's orbit faced their own fates. Variety Jones, the mysterious advisor who once guided Ross, was eventually arrested in Thailand and extradited to the United States. Several major vendors and associates were apprehended and prosecuted. Investigators continued dismantling Silk Road's successors, each one learning from the mistakes of the last. But for Ross, the story had reached a tragic end. He was transferred to a high-security federal penitentiary, cut off from the digital world that once empowered him. He spent his days reading, studying, and communicating with his family. His mother became one of his most vocal advocates, fighting tirelessly for his release. Supporters campaigned for clemency, arguing that Ross deserved a second chance. Despite the darkness surrounding Silk Road's legacy, Ross's story continues to spark debate. Some view him as a criminal, others as a visionary ahead of his time. But almost everyone agrees on one point: a series of small mistakes, human flaws, and overlooked details transformed a young idealist into the central figure of one of the most extraordinary digital manhunts of the 21st century. His empire collapsed in seconds, but its impact still echoes across the internet, serving as both a cautionary tale and a symbol of how powerful ideas can become when unleashed into the world, whether intended or not.